Solving the case of Kevin Barlow. The swollen corpse of Kevin Barlow was found in a pile of trash at a dark alleyway. Aside from being disembodied, his remains were in extremely bad condition since it was feasted on by rats and other pests scavenging for food. His butchered body was a clear indication that he was murdered. He was missing a left hand and both feet, which suggested that he was tortured prior to his death. He had 17 stab wounds from different sharp weapons. The body had deep puncture wounds made by a cylindrical edge like an ice pick, which resulted to internal bleeding, and there were wide lacerations identifiable to the cuts of a jagged camping blade. The most severe cut was right across his throat, which was probably done to make sure that he wouldn't survive. This gruesome murder was not the first of its kind. Sadly, these crimes were relatively common around the community. Different gangs clash and rule over the streets, and young people ranging from 16 to early 20s often get involved with illegal trades and gang disputes. Based on his record, Kevin Barlow was most likely affiliated with these wayward individuals. He was caught for possession of illegal drugs in the past. He also had other offenses such as theft, assault, and various displays of unlawful acts. Since his body was laid on a mound of waste and chewed on by pests, finding any trace of evidence to obtain a lead was nearly impossible. As a result, his case remained unsolved for a very long time. 1 year later, Kevin's closest friends gathered during his birthday to honor him and continue their childhood tradition. He belonged to a small group of 4 people who grew up together and trusted each other more than anyone else. They went to an abandoned building where they used to hang out when Kevin was still alive. But no matter how hard they tried to be as cheerful as they could to brighten up their mood of the celebration, their strong discontent regarding their friend's unsolved murder was bound to be the main topic of their conversation. Kevin's best friend Hugo was always with him, and he was aware of his illegal activities and his shady affiliates. It would have been easier to find out who was responsible for his death if his activities were only limited to the crimes instigated by these people, but Kevin had gained too many enemies that Hugo couldn't narrow down the list of potential suspects. Hugo tried to divert their attention by joking around while getting drunk. He poked fun of their eccentric friend Lena, who was into supernatural things. He thoughtlessly asked if Kevin's ghost was around so they could ask him directly about what happened to him. Lena remained silent and ignored what Hugo said, just like how she always did. But when the sun went down and the bottles of liquors ran dry, Kevin's ex-lover Stacy revealed the other reason why they gathered in that particular place. Out of desperation and grief, Stacy asked Lena if she knew a way for them to talk to their friend who passed away. Surely enough, Lena had learned different ways to summon spirits. She offered Stacy some options, but she also discouraged her to push through. Stacy chose the most effective yet most dangerous method that Lena knew how to perform, and Lena had no choice but to help her. As expected, it was hard for Hugo to take the idea seriously. He was laughing hysterically while Stacy was trying to explain what they had to do. But he was abruptly silenced when Lena pulled out a chalk, some candles, and a strange book from her bag. When Stacy mentioned that they would try to call out Kevin's spirit, he was expecting them to use a Ouija board or any of the likes that were relatively common. However, what Lena had was a very old grimoire that contained ritual prayers. The cover of the book was made of animal skin with the branding of a sigil on the front, and the pages were so old that they were nearly withered. The contents were full of diagrams and written in medieval Latin. Hugo was very hesitant at first, but when Stacy spoke about Kevin's unsolved case and her willingness to do anything in order to bring justice to his death, he felt her unshakable resolve and couldn't argue with her. Despite of his doubts, they proceeded with the ritual. Lena explained what they had to do and the risks involved in conjuring a spirit. She told him that summoning a particular person would be harder than finding a needle in a haystack. Performing a summoning ritual would be like lighting up a beacon in a void full of souls who wish to cross over the living world, and they had to attract Kevin first before the others could force themselves through. They chose to do it in the abandoned building in hopes that Kevin's spirit would recognize the place and they would use Stacy's blood to draw him in. Lacey and Hugo carefully followed Lena's instructions. For their protection from any wandering spirits, Lena wrote a row of symbols in every corner of the building and lit a candle right in front of them. Aside from the front door where they were expecting Kevin to enter, they made sure that all the other possible entryways were shut closed to avoid any intrusion. The building was a former primary school with 2 floors and 12 rooms. Lena and Lacey checked the second floor while Hugo handled the ground floor. As he checked the bathroom, Hugo heard someone snoring inside one of the cubicles. It was Old Man Clayton, a junkie who was also staying in the abandoned building from time to time. Fortunately, Hugo was able to spot him before they began the ritual. In order to make him leave, Hugo gave him some money and told him to get some dinner for himself. Despite of being high, the old man was still sane enough to feel hungry, and so he took the offer and left. When all the precautions were prepared, Stacy, Hugo, and Lena locked themselves inside an empty room on the second floor. Lena drew a protection circle on the floor with various sigils around it. This sigil was their last line of defense in case something would go wrong. Lena's high level of cautiousness clearly showed her experience in the craft. She then drew a triangular diagram within the circle and placed a round mirror at the center. This triangle was the key for conjuring the spirit of Kevin, and they were told to sit on each side to surround it. Hugo and Stacy just watched as Lena placed a silver bowl on top of the mirror, and she began to chant with a different language. Upon instruction, Stacy made a small cut in her palm and released some blood in the bowl. The stray dogs roaming outside of the building began to howl, and the air grew colder inside of the room even though all the windows were shut. Lena rolled a black stone in the bowl while continuing her prayer, and the clanging of the stone resonated in a very unnatural manner. The ringing reverberated and echoed within the entire room until the stone sat still on Stacy's blood. All of a sudden, everything went dead silent. Despite of all the precautions that Lena had implemented, things did not go as smoothly as she wanted. While the three teenagers were doing the ritual, Clayton walked back into the building when he realized that he forgot his stash. As he was on his way back to the bathroom, he saw the lit candle and the symbols written on the wall and got intrigued by it. He looked closer and brushed his fingers across the writing, which smudged some of the characters, and when the dog suddenly howled, he felt a waft of cold wind breezing to his nape. Goosebumps crawled all over his skin and he instinctively took a step back. Clayton unintentionally stepped on the candle and put out the flame. The protection that surrounded the building was broken because of what he did, and they would all suffer because of it. Clayton started hearing subtle voices, and he couldn't tell where they were coming from. The sound drew closer and closer with each passing second. He did not know what was happening, but he was cowering in fear. There were countless voices of people wailing in misery and yelling in anger, and the noises grew overwhelmingly loud. He covered his ears and ran towards the door, but he was stopped on his tracks by a sound that completely petrified him. Amongst the cries and groans, he heard a malicious laughter that paralyzed every muscle in his body. His knees wobbled out of fear and he fell on the floor. Meanwhile, Stacy and the others started to hear the wailing voices as well. Hugo peeked through the window to see what was happening outside, and he was more than surprised by what he saw. The landscape of the world outside of the building was overlapped by a silhouette of a completely different terrain. Everything looked hazy as their vicinity was enshrouded by a thick fog. Similar to a mirage, there was a sea of sand that stretched as far as his eyes could see. The sky was dark and the moon was missing. The dark clouds were wallowing unnaturally fast as if a big storm was coming. Lena explained that what he was seeing was the world of the dead momentarily colliding with the world of the living. Aside from the otherworldly scenery, he was terrified when he saw countless spirits rallying towards their direction. At that point, Lena had realized that something went wrong. A few seconds later, she anxiously warned Stacy and Hugo to stay within the circle no matter what. A mob of distressed ghosts suddenly came forth and crowded the room in an instant. Lacey screamed in fear while Hugo was completely dumbfounded by what he was seeing. They expected to experience something unfathomable when they agreed to perform the ritual, but a horde of troubled souls crying and shouting all at once was simply too overwhelming for anyone. Lena was about to undo the ritual to get themselves out of this terrifying predicament, but Lacey begged her to wait a little longer in hopes that Kevin's spirit would show up as well. The souls were ardently spilling their hearts out as they uttered their regrets, hatred, and misery about their past lives. They were talking over each other while some were wordlessly wailing and growling. The souls were desperately trying to approach the three teenagers to take their bodies for themselves, but the protection circle was preventing them from passing through. They were climbing over one another as they hit an invisible wall that surrounded Lena and the others. Driven by nothing else but their strong emotions, they all behaved like primal entities who lost their sense of humanity. However, they weren't the only ones who came. Unlike the human souls, this particular one was quite cunning and genuinely evil. Hugo and the others were confused when they saw the old man Clayton casually entering the room amidst the turmoil. His facial expression and eerily calm composure were very different from the free-spirited junkie that they had knew. Hugo shouted at him and asked why he was still in the building, but he did not respond. He passed through the mob of souls as if they were nothing, and he stood close to the circle with a grin on his face. Hugo was about to approach him, but Lena immediately pulled him back. She realized that Clayton was no longer himself. Lena felt a heavy atmosphere ever since he entered the room. Clayton was possessed by an entity that was far more sinister than any troubled spirit. With her experience, she recognized the hostile and domineering presence of a demon within him. The demon posed as Clayton and tried to convince them to let him in the circle, but Lena easily revealed his lie by stating that he should have no problem walking across if he was indeed the man which he claimed to be. When his first attempt immediately failed, the demon decided to push his trickery a bit further. Few moments later, he mimicked the voice of Kevin and tried to trick Lacey. She started crying when she heard his lover's voice for the first time in a while. However, she was well aware that it wasn't really him. Hugo got mad at the demon for using his best friend's voice and started cursing him, and he was infuriated even further when the demon impersonated the voice of his late father. The demon was purposely trying to get him mad so he would step out of the circle to attack him, but Hugo did his best to hold back and covered his ears instead. When he realized that deception wouldn't work on them, the demon decided to make a radical approach. The next thing they witnessed was so unnerving that even an experienced occultist like Lena was caught off guard. Bones crackled and broke while Clayton's body reformed. His hairs fell off and horns protruded from his head as the demon abandoned his disguise and revealed his true form. His skin stretched and tore as he grew significantly taller. His feet and hands grew larger and his nails were replaced with claws. The demon bit his own wrist and sucked out some blood from his veins. He then spat it out right at the writing on the floor, and a small portion of the sigil was washed out by the blood. The protection was broken, and all the desperate souls aggressively lunged towards Hugo and the two girls. The mob of ghosts repeatedly passed through their bodies in an attempt to take them over. Lacey, Lena, and Hugo's consciousness started to wane as their physical energies were being drained. They felt unnaturally nauseous and fatigued. Lacey fell on her knees and was on the brink of blacking out. Lena was desperately trying to get to the conjuring triangle. She was just a few feet away from it, but she couldn't even move an inch. He told Hugo to break the mirror and release the link between the world of the living and the dead. The demon laughed at them as he walked past the broken circle. He grabbed Hugo by the neck and tossed him around the room while the souls were persistently trying to possess them. In Lena's view, she saw both of her friends in a brink of death. She could see Lacey's spirit slowly getting pushed out of her body, and the demon was about to attack Hugo again. In order to spare them, Lena began chanting a prayer to get the demon's attention. It could not banish nor hurt him, but she knew that hearing the prayer would agitate him, and as she expected, the demon turned around to face her. Unfortunately, she was about to lose consciousness as well. She couldn't even tell how many souls had passed right through her body, and her sight was getting hazier and hazier with each passing second. As the demon approached while grinding his teeth, Lena saw a particular ghost trying to push Lacey's spirit back to her body. While the demon was distracted, Hugo crawled back to the triangle and aggressively smashed the mirror with his own fist. The distressed spirits instantaneously dispersed as the link between the two worlds were finally undone. Luckily for them, the demon was also expelled. A demon or a soul could not possess a dead man, and Clayton was killed when he decided to reshape his body. The severely broken body of Clayton crashed on the floor like a puppet that lost its strings. The unexpected help that prevented Lacey's body from being overtaken was no other than the ghost of Kevin, and he whispered in her ear before he disappeared. When the chaos was finally over, the three teenagers passed out due to exhaustion. What happened that night was far worse than they could have imagined, but they achieved their goal nonetheless. On the following day, the local authorities received an anonymous call regarding the unsolved case of Kevin Barlow. They decided to investigate an individual named Larry Kenzie. He was one of the gang leaders who clashed with Kevin in several occasions. He strongly denied the accusation, but the anonymous caller also gave a substantial detail aside from his name. The officers gave a bone to Larry's dog, and they observed what he would do with it. The dog dug a hole in Larry's yard where he was keeping the other bones, and inside the burrow, they found the bones of Kevin Barlow's missing left hand and feet.